Welcome to the webinar. My name is Timothy Lay. I am the Analysis Manager at ACLED, or the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, the leading source of data on global conflict. And today I'll be moderating this session. Today we are launching the third report in a joint series of publications between ACLED and GI-TOC, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. This series is focused on non-state armed groups and illicit economies in West Africa. This publication that we're launching today focuses on the activity of Anglophone separatists in Cameroon. Today, we are joined by two authors of the report, Dr. Lad Sewat, who is ACLED's Africa Regional Specialist, and Dr. Eleanor Beaver, who is the Senior Analyst in the West Africa Observatory at GI-TOC. Together, they will walk us through some of the report's findings. We also have the pleasure of hosting an expert panel. First off, we have Dr. Manu Lekunze, who is an international specialist and lecturer in international relations at the University of Aberdeen. His research has examined questions in maritime strategy, insurgency, intelligence, defense policy, political economy, and complexity silence. Unfortunately, our other scheduled panelist for today, Dr. Edouard Yogo, will be unable to join us, and we apologize for that. Following the presentation from Lad and Eleanor, Dr. Lekunze will provide commentary on Anglophone separatism in Cameroon. You will then have the opportunity to ask questions during a live Q&A at the end of the session. Feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A function throughout the event. Finally, we are joined by Aaron A. Amabu. Aaron is an ACLED-trained conflict incident monitor at Reach Out Cameroon, an ACLED partner organization. Since 2020, he has been dedicated to monitoring and reporting conflict incidents to provide timely insights that inform intervention and community engagement strategies for his organization. And with that, I pass it across to Aaron to start us off from here.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Hello, everyone. Once more, I am Aaron Amabo, a conflict incident monitor from Reach Out. And I'm thankful for this opportunity to be part of this panel. And I also want to thank ACLED and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime for this initiative, because I believe it's going to raise a lot of awareness, which is lacking with regards to the crisis in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon. It is not one of the most neglected crises in the world for nothing. And I believe that this is a wonderful initiative. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to have me speak at this event. As we are aware, we are facing a socio-political crisis turns armed insurgency that has been happening since 2016, but kicked off, we can say, actively on the 1st of October 2017 with the unilateral declaration of the independence of Ambazonian, for the formerly British Southern Cameroons. And at the beginning of the crisis, there was a lot of euphoria from the local populations, which was manifested in the large number of people who carried out peaceful demonstrations in the major cities of the Northwest and Southwest regions. But as time passes, we have noticed a drop in the euphoria and the enthusiasm, which has also ultimately led to a drop in funding for these actors, who have resorted to other means to fund their activities. We noticed in May 2022, there was a protest in some villages, especially in Oku, against the separatist fighters, which used to be a stronghold of separatist support in the Northwest regions, which is in stark contrast to what we saw on the 1st of October 2017, which reveals a drop in popularity of armed separatist groups, and which has also led to their drop in funding, and now they have to find alternative means of funding to fund their activities. We have abductions for ransom, which are very rampant. We have looting of property, and we have the sale of illicit fuel, and we have in roadblocks where they extort road traffickers money to allow them to pass. And then we also have the liberation tax, which has also been a great source of pain and grief for civilian populations, because they issue a receipt after the tax is paid, and if you are caught without a receipt, you are in trouble. If the security forces catch you with a receipt, you are still in trouble, which means that either way, civilians end up suffering as a result of this. And the crisis too has caused other problems that were quite latent in our communities, especially with regards to farmers and grazers, because we know at the beginning of the crisis, the grazers who are predominantly from the Mbororo ethnic group weren't much in support of separatist fighters who then targeted their cattle and their livestock. So this forced the graziers to side with state security forces, which sometimes arms them and uses them as community informants. And so this has emboldened them, and they carry out raids, raping and attacking civilians. So there were other latent issues within our communities that have been raised or that have been caused by the crisis. And right now we face multi-phase crisis where we don't just have non-state armed groups against security forces, but we have farmers against grazers, we have grazers against non-state armed groups, and vice versa. So, and now one of the biggest issues that has come up with regards to attributing responsibility has come with the fact that it is difficult to identify who is whom. Identifying actors has become extremely difficult because we have situations in which non-state armed groups dress in military attire and attack civilians. We have situations in which members of security forces disguise as members of non-state armed groups to extort and attack civilians. And we have situations in which common criminals have just taken the whole context, have taken advantage of the whole situation to make money for themselves. So sometimes in monitoring and documenting these incidents, it has become quite difficult because it is difficult to know who is whom and who is doing what where, who is responsible for what. That's one of the latest developments with regards to the crisis. And now civilians are torn, and some of the most affected groups are, you have humanitarian actors who have difficulties negotiating access into different locations because they can't identify whom they're negotiating their access with. So in general, that is the context in which we are working, and I am happy that ACLED and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime has taken their time out to map out separatist financing in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I'll take over, if I may, and start presenting some of the information from the report that we gathered on armed group financing, and go into a little bit more depth on some of the issues that Aaron has outlined in regard to financing. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you, and the one after that, actually. Thank you. We have here a comparison between the situation in 2017 and 2018, when the conflict was starting to take hold, and the present situation. So as you can see from the chart on the right, the number of distinct separatist groups has increased quite remarkably in the course of these few years. And one of the arguments that we've made in this paper is that the changing modes of finance for the Anglophone separatist armed groups have been extremely influential in that splintering process. It's not the only factor, of course, but it is an important one. And so in these 10 minutes, I want to look at how the group's financing has changed over time, and also how this helped to get us from this situation where we had a smaller number of armed groups to a really large, disparate number of smaller groups. Now, we shouldn't insinuate that there was ever a great amount of unity within the separatist movement. Early on, there was the formation of two quite distinct major umbrella groups for organising the separatist cause, those being the Ambazonian Governing Council and the Interim Government of Ambazonia. And a rivalry developed between them. Most of the people who were involved in these structures were based abroad, and this brings us to the important role that was played by the Anglophone Cameroonian diaspora. And it's worth taking a minute to contextualize the motives of the diaspora supporters a bit more. Cameroon does not allow dual nationality, and anyway, given that tensions were rising around the Anglophone discussion, this would have been a very difficult matter to campaign around if you were based in Cameroon anyway. And it's also worth repeating that there are a lot of different opinions about what the Anglophone cause is and should be, and what political formation would best safeguard the rights of Anglophone Cameroonians. So you have the more radical camp, which believes in a separate state, while there are also more moderate camps who advocate for federalism or for decentralized government. But for those diaspora members who wanted to support the Anglophone cause, whichever way they may interpret that, and in one way or another, sending money and fundraising was one of the few ways that they felt able to engage in this. And one caveat that we should make here is that, at least according to some of our sources, many of the diaspora members who donated to the Anglophone cause did so because they wanted to support humanitarian or political efforts rather than militant ones. And reportedly, some people felt misled when they found out that some of their donations were being used to support armed groups. That said, there is also no doubt that some fundraising efforts were very clearly framed for being for the purpose of supporting separatist fighters. But the question for our purposes is, what kind of relationship did this fundraising create between the diaspora and the armed groups? Can we go to the next slide, please? And the one after that. Thank you. So when you are an armed group and you have few or no resources, you started life as a very localized, perhaps village level defense group, and then you find yourself up against a very well-armed opponent, you don't say no to offers of money, even if those giving it want a degree of control in return. And indeed, a lot of this was phrased in terms of solidarity, and these relationships developed quite willingly. And that provision of money from the diaspora that was being transferred to some of these groups enabled individuals in the diaspora to carve out roles within the separatist conflict that looked something like leadership. So money was being passed through the political wings to the armed groups, and in doing so, organizations such as the Ambazonian Governing Council and the Interim Government were able to carve out a kind of coordination role for the armed groups on the ground. But there were also cases of individuals taking it upon themselves to fund smaller groups, particularly if they had perhaps a local connection to them. So these, there were also more disparate individuals who were able to acquire at least a degree of influence, if not control, over the armed groups. Still, it didn't take very long for Cameroonian security services to detect that these transfers were happening through regular money transfer services. Intelligence began following the people sent to pick up money at the transfer branches on behalf of the armed groups. And then began tracking down the people involved in the financing networks. And this led to a number of arrests, at least within Cameroon. And likewise, there were new regulations placed on the use of money transfer services. So this state-led crackdown was one important factor in reducing the flow of financial support from the diaspora to the armed groups. Could we please go to the next slide? But the other major factor that led to the reduction of that support was the deterioration in the behavior of many of these armed groups. Now, the fact is that the diaspora leaders, if you like, were very far from the action, and they had never really been in a position to direct the day-to-day activities of these armed groups, and they didn't have a great deal of control or authority to be able to do so. The money that they provided gave them influence, but not control. And one of the major factors that fast-tracked the breakdown of that influence was kidnap for ransom by the armed separatists. So you can see from this graph that there was already a small number of kidnap for ransom incidents cropping up in 2018. And that's increased every year since, particularly after 2020. And that increase reflects a vicious cycle. So kidnap for ransom was always one of the most damaging practices in terms of the armed group's legitimacy in the eyes of civilians. So as you can see from the quote on screen, the more that kidnap was used, the less willing diaspora supporters were to fund the armed groups. So as a result, the more reliant, the armed groups became more and more reliant on illicit activity for money, and that included kidnap for ransom. And the ransoms that are generally paid out, they vary in quantity, but they're generally not particularly high. The ransoms usually or quite often come in under $1,000 US, which means that fighters compensate for these relatively low payments with quite a high number of kidnaps. Now, certainly there were also bandit groups, and you could call them semi-professional kidnappers, who took advantage of this instability and used them as a cover for their own activities. And it's also true that there have been cases of diaspora leaders encouraging the kidnap of people that they saw as disloyal to the cause. So it would be wrong to present this as a purely as a problem that was purely local to Northwest and Southwest Cameroon. Nevertheless, kidnap was really important in the breakdown of trust between many of the separatist armed groups and the pro-separatist members of the diaspora. And so as kidnap just became more and more prevalent among separatist armed groups, you likewise would reach a state where there were more and more divisions within these armed groups between the more politically committed fighters and those who wanted to focus on making money from the fact that they were armed. And this was very important to the fragmentation of the groups, and part of the reason why the sheer number of groups has increased so much. Can I pass to the next slide, please? So we don't have a whole lot of time here to go over the other aspects of financing in depth, and Aaron introduced some of them very well anyway. And we also don't have too much time to go into the other aspect that we discuss quite a lot in the report, which is what we call resourcing, which is essentially how armed groups obtain their resources. We look particularly at arms, but I'm happy to discuss that aspect in Q&A, etc. And it's all in the report. I will quickly touch on the aspect that Aaron was introducing, which is this notion of taxation or extortion, depending on how you see it. Because as he described, it is extremely it is something that really affects civilian life at the moment. And it's also important because it has major implications for armed group legitimacy. So separatist groups demand tax or contributions. They might use lots of different words, or liberation tax from civilians in almost every aspect of their lives. And it's summed up quite nicely in the quote from this fighter. So you have tax on roadblocks, you have tax on road transport, you have tax on social events, you have tax on food crops, you also have taxes on service provisions, such as it is not directly provided by fighters, but generally taxed nevertheless. And when these taxes or these contributions are demanded, they're framed in a way as a measure of support for the war effort. As you can see here, he says this giving of money to us means that they identify with the cause. And this puts civilians in an extremely difficult position. If they aren't able to give it or they refuse to give it, there is a risk that they will be identified as someone who isn't supportive of the cause, potentially a collaborator or a traitor, someone who can come to be known as a blackleg. Being identified as this can have very violent and even deadly consequences for the accused. So while there might still be people who are genuine supporters of some of these armed groups and contribute freely, there will also be a huge majority who feel that they have no choice but to give out this money. There's a whole other range of ways that they levy taxes on a variety of products. One quite interesting example is that levying taxes on alcoholic drinks from the Brasserie du Cameroon company, which is a company whose goods have been technically banned by the separatist groups themselves. However, for a tax, they're willing to make exceptions for bar owners who want it. Like Aaron said, they play a huge role in taxing the supply of illicit fuel that's coming over the Nigerian border. This is something that we discuss quite extensively in the report, and it's worth saying that given that there is next to no provision for illicit non-smuggled fuel in particularly in the Northwest region, that is a really essential trade, not only to the livelihoods of people who sell it, but also to the mobility of anyone who needs fuel for their movements in the Northwest. So it's really essential to daily life, and that will also give you an idea of the scale of the trade and the potential for levying taxes on it. We'd be happy to discuss these a little bit more in detail later, but for now I will hand over to Lad, who will give us a better profile of the armed groups as they stand at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nella. And I think this follows well from your point, kind of highlighting the kidnapping and abductions, the looting and taxation. If we can move to the next slide, what we can really see is this kind of growth over time throughout the conflict for violence targeting civilians. So in this graph, we're seeing not only abductions, but also physical violence, those attacks, and in more recent years, the use of sort of crude explosives, a lot of times in the form of IEDs. So as you can see on the left of the graph, around 2017 until 2019, civilian targeting was actually higher by state forces, and this sort of generated the legitimacy of a lot of separatist fighters as sort of defenders of civilian populations and a legitimate alternative to the violence that many civilians were experiencing from the state from that time. However, in 2020, this changed, and we saw separatist militias targeting civilians at least in equal proportion to state forces, and this sort of aligns with what Nella was talking about, where we saw this rise in kidnapping. We saw more and more violence carried out by separatists themselves against civilian populations, and in turn diminishing their credibility to the diaspora, limiting the funding that the diaspora was willing to give. And then in the last few years, we've seen really an exponential rise in separatist violence, where the violence against civilians that has been carried out by state forces has remained relatively consistent. It's been, just escalating rather rapidly by separatist fighters, especially as we see them fragment, competing for smaller and smaller territory and areas of influence. The civilians that we see affected most largely are those that are part of various labor groups, those that own businesses, that are involved in different industries or trade unions. And a lot of this is because the separatist fighters tend to use sort of ghost town or lockdown type tactics in order to limit any commercial activity going on in various cities, oftentimes also limiting things like education. But those that violate these ghost town tactics end up being targeted by separatist fighters. There's a number of other groups that we look into in the course of the report as far as those targeted, and that includes those perceived as supporters of the Yaoundé government, called Blacklegs. We also see a number of groups targeted who are sort of traditional chiefs that might also be perceived to be supporters of the Francophone regime. And we, yeah, also go into a number of women targeted as well by separatist fighters. So there's a number of other groups, but I just wanted to highlight these different labor groups that are especially targeted. So if we could have the next slide, please. And so in the course of the conflict, we initially saw quite a lot of the demonstration movements happening in more urban areas of the Anglophone region. These were, conducted by various teachers and lawyers. And some of the violence that happened initially was in areas with a higher population density. And what we've noticed in more recent years is sort of a shift of the violence towards more rural areas. So separatist fighters seem to be moving their tactics and basing themselves in less populated areas. And I think this also feeds into this general argument that they've lost legitimacy amongst many civilians in the Anglophone region. That in the initial stages of the conflict, they were able to often base themselves within more populated areas with civilian support. Sometimes this led to reprisals by the state amongst separatist fighters themselves, but also civilian populations that were seen or perceived as supporting the separatists. However, as they've lost legitimacy, they've had to move out of these areas. And there's also tactical advantages to this, that sometimes fighters are able to sort of utilize the forests and more mountainous terrain. They often have more crude weapons than the military. And so in order to gain advantage, tactical advantages, they can kind of utilize these more rural areas against military forces who are less familiar with that terrain. And yeah, so this is really something that we saw starting in 2021 and then continuing to the present. So next slide, please. The organizational structure of the separatist groups at this point is a bit challenging to speak to as a coherent whole. The groups are increasingly fragmenting and moving into more and more smaller groups. However, we do still have some larger groups, SOCADEF, for example, that retains a broader organizational structure. A lot of this coming from the competing diaspora political groups abroad, and sharing of resources and sometimes command to various generals. And in turn, those generals lead smaller groups of mission commanders, sometimes called subgenerals, who then in turn oversee multiple units of fighters. As Nella mentioned before, we also have examples where individual diaspora leaders will also have these connections, offering commands and funding to a specific separatist group, kind of bypassing the broader organizational structure that we see from the larger groups, but still maintaining this connection with diaspora leadership. However, with the fragmentation, I think it's important to highlight that more and more groups are kind of they're no longer receiving funding or commands from the diaspora. They've localized leadership and are largely operating, with leadership on the ground. So I think that probably represents the majority of groups that we're seeing proliferate in the last few years. Next slide, please. So with all of this, we see kind of the efforts of governance kind of changing. I think if you were to look at the various websites and the publications of Anglophone separatists, especially their political wings, you would see entire ministries devoted to education, to the provision of public services, that there's various ministers in charge of all of this. And initially, there seemed to be that effort, interest in running schools and providing public services, but from the interviews and fieldwork that was conducted for this research, what we saw was around 2019, much of this started falling apart. And public service provision at this point in the Anglophone region is really quite a patchwork. Some provision by the Yaoundé government, some by the private sector, humanitarian organizations, and there are still some separatist groups that might be providing this, in an ad hoc way, maybe some occasional provision of justice. There were some that spoke about the inputs for certain crops. Still the perception, at least, of security provision against violence from state forces, whether that's just perceived or actual, it's sometimes hard to tell, but that the actual provision of governance has become quite limited. As Nella showed, a lot of the taxation that is being conducted by separatists does occur along the roadways in the Anglophone region. We've been able to map much of that. And then there is an effort to control civilian populations, and much of this is happening quite violently. So if I could move to the next slide, please. And I just want to give a moment to look forward. Now, kind of taken collectively, I know we've talked about the abductions, the kind of violence targeting civilians as a whole. But if we look at this kind of together, and in this graph, we can see the breakdown between the Northwest and Southwest region, as well as comparing this to the rest of Cameroon, we see this kind of escalation of the conflict, concerningly shifting towards more and more towards the Northwest region of Cameroon. And this seems to be building so far in 2024, that the second quarter of 2024 was actually the most violent of the conflict so far. So while we don't have annual data for this yet, what we can see is that conflict is escalating, and that the fragmentation of this conflict is increasing the levels of violence, but it's also weakening the bargaining position of the separatist movement, which I think makes peace negotiations more difficult. There's more groups with more competing interests, and so bringing those groups to the table will be quite challenging. As I think we have mentioned, these many of the peace negotiations so far have kind of tried to bring in much of the diaspora, and while I think that is still important, the localization of leadership within the separatist movement will likely require further engagement with local organizations, with these local leaders, in order to make mediation possible, if that is possible. But as we want to highlight and can't reiterate enough, civilians are in a very vulnerable position, often targeted both by separatists as well as the state, and with frequent crackdowns even for suspected of collaboration on either side. So I think with that, I can hand over to Manu.
Hi. Can you hear me? I have a bit of sound problems at this end, so I
Yes, we
try
can
to
hear
manage it without. Okay. So thank you very much for a great report. I read the report, and when I was reading it, like every other academic, my aim was to find something wrong with it so that I can come here and argue about how you've so greatly missed something that is going on in Cameroon. But you'll be surprised to hear that the report sounds really familiar to me, and that is that is saying that it's a great report, because I've been doing research on this ever since it started, and if it's familiar to me, it shows that you've captured the reality really well. And the only thing I'm going to say today is thank you very much for having a broad view that captures everything, and it can educate the rest of the world on how the conflict is, how it's progressing, and some of the background that you've given. And people can then analyze it and begin to predict what might happen next. So, great report. That's my comment. And the other things that I would say would walk around a little bit of questions, because not maybe things that you could have explained in a different way, but the general gist or my general view on the report is it's that it has captured the reality really well in a way that I haven't seen somewhere else except for the crisis group. So this is really good. But I don't know if this was part of your remit, but what about explaining why? Were you able to explain why certain things are the way they are? I'll give you an example with regards to the actual events or the actual attacks moving towards rural areas instead of urban areas. Because at the beginning of the conflict, most of the violence was in urban or suburban areas. Is it possible to explain why there is a reverse in this case? But I don't know. This might not be part of what you are trying to do. You may just want to capture what is going on without explaining why. But I think it's that maybe if we dig into it a little bit to ask questions why, maybe we might understand the conflict a little bit more. And then the second thing, I kind of got an impression on the play the influence had on the conflict at the beginning, that the actual violence on the ground. It appears to me that you're saying that while they gave money, they didn't have actual, they didn't dictate what happened on the ground on a daily basis. But my sense is that in some small cases, there were actually individuals at the beginning who did command, if you use that word, activities on the ground. So maybe it's something to have a look at. But generally speaking, I think this is a well done report. It captures the reality really well. So I wouldn't take too much time talking so that other people can talk. But those are the two main areas that I want to raise for you to think about in the report. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manu. Maybe we can condense those questions that he posed to Nilla and Lad into the Q&A section. So before we move to that, first off, I just wanted to thank Lad and Eleanor for that really insightful presentation of the report. And also, again, I wanted to reiterate a very warm thank you to our panelists, Aaron and Manu, for helping us to put this work into context. So with that, I'd like to pass it across to the Q&A. Lad, would you be able to kick us off perhaps with Manu's first question around the movement from urban to more rural areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an important question. I touched on it briefly during the presentation, but I think this largely was the drop in popularity amongst the separatist movement, that initially we saw support from urban areas, from the educated parts of the Anglophone population, the teachers and judges, lawyers, especially, who were widely involved in the demonstration movement from the start, and the ability for separatists to live in more urban areas and in major towns. Of course, the military also had some tactical advantages to pushing them out over the course of kind of 2018, especially until 2020, when we started seeing the shift towards more rural areas. And that's when we started seeing violence move into these more rural, mountainous, forested areas. And along with the inability of separatists to kind of live among civilian populations as they once did, we also had military kind of having the upper hand tactically in those areas, and separatists then relocating to more rural areas for those reasons. So I think that's really what we explore in the report, but I think that's the main driver of the shift from urban to rural.
Thank you, Lad. And Miller, did you have something to add on the second question posed by?
Sure. Yeah, this may have been me slightly poorly expressing myself. I think that yeah, Manu's absolutely right. There were diaspora members who were extremely involved in the planning of operations, and we've even heard rumors that they were involved in gathering intelligence through various ways and then passing them on to fighters, and to some degree involved in coordination as well. The point I was trying to make more was that I think it became very difficult for those diaspora leadership to set boundaries and set rules that were obeyed by the fighters on a regular basis, and that those fighters also had the ability to ignore those commands when it became to ignore diaspora influence when it became less convenient for them, and as there was less and less financial support coming out of the diaspora, there was less and less incentive for them to obey the preferences of diaspora leaders. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. With that, I'll open it up to Q&A from the audiences. We have about 15 minutes left, so unfortunately we won't be able to get through all the questions, but we'll try and get through as many as possible. So first off, I'd like to kick it over to Lad. We've got a couple of questions specifically about Nigeria's approach and any possible intervention, as well as kind of the interactions between what we're seeing with Biafra and the Ambazonian separatism. So I wonder if, Lad, if you could elaborate a little bit more on those two related issues.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think I can speak from the ACLED perspective in terms of the specific incidents of violence. And then maybe, Nella, if you want to also approach that question a little bit from any further interconnections you might have picked up on. But I think from what we can see with from the ACLED side is a rising number of incidents from groups like the Biafra Nations League, the BNL, and those really started rising around 2021, and then kind of almost doubling each year since. So we have seen a rising number of incidents involving the Nigerian groups, separatist groups, in Anglophone Cameroon. That contestation is primarily against the Cameroonian military forces. We don't see a lot of contestation against separatists, nor do we see a lot of clear collaboration during clashes against the military. Whether or not there's further collaboration kind of outside of that, whether they're trading, in terms of resources or communication, that part is a bit unclear or falls outside of ACLED's purview. But we certainly are seeing that rising level of operations of those groups in recent years.
Nella, did you have anything further to add to that, or Manu?
I think Lad's covered that very well, but I'd certainly be interested to hear any additional thoughts from Manu.
So in terms of collaboration, what I've seen is that joint operations you hardly ever hear, but the connection is in the sense that the region is a crime region, and there are networks that both the separatists in Nigeria as well as those in Cameroon use. So they use very similar, say, weapon supply or munition supply networks. One of the clear connections I saw is charms. So they believe that you could have bulletproof charms is very much coming from Nigeria, and the so-called charm producers or distributors are Nigerian, most of them. Some of them would actually go into the villages to prepare the soldiers. So that it's one of the connections that they share in the region.
Great, thank you both for those insights about the connections that we are seeing between Nigeria and Cameroon there. Next off, we have a question specifically about the backing of Ambazonian separatists in terms of arming those groups. We've actually got a couple of questions on that. I wonder, Eleanor, if you could speak a little bit to what we're seeing there in terms of who's backing these from a military, or rather an arms perspective.
Sure. So there's been a couple of quite high profile arms trafficking cases. The one that probably got the most attention was that in 2019 there were seizures in the US of stashes of military grade weapons, both from private homes and from shipping containers. And these were effectively caches of arms that had been bought and organized by US-based pro-separatist diaspora that they were trying to ship to Nigeria for then transfer on to Cameroon. And the US Department of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms stepped in and managed to seize those weapons and arrest the people in charge. And it's also worth noting that that was considered that's considered by many Cameroon officials as too little too late, and that there was more activity in terms of support for arms purchases by the US diaspora that in the view of Yaoundé should have been cracked down on earlier, and in the view of the US was not something that they had much jurisdiction over outside of US soil, I believe. But yeah, that was certainly a point of contention. Now, in regards to kind of more, those transfers that were directly organized in the US were, I believe, were I believe among a small in the minority, and it was much the most common source of arms for the separatists has been Nigeria, and there's been a lot of small scale arms transfers. We have a few stories in the report of, for instance, a small number of firearms being hidden in the backs of motorbikes. There's a lot of trucks going over the Nigerian border because it's a very important supplier of all sorts of consumer goods for Cameroon. So it's very easy, given that it's a very porous border, for arms to be stashed within those movements. And what we know is that, yes, Nigeria has plenty of quite well-organized arms traffickers who may have had roles in this, but there's also plenty of room for more opportunistic purchases of arms on a kind of more ad hoc basis. And Manu may have more to add on that, but yeah, there's been a few different sources.
Yeah, so just to agree with what Elena is saying and to say that to be a little bit clear, so in terms of backing and arms supply, I haven't, maybe Elena has seen it, I haven't seen any evidence of a state backing the armed groups. So yes, because of all the problems that Nigeria has, it's a lot easier to smuggle arms through Nigeria, and the long border between Nigeria and Cameroon, it's much easier to smuggle arms from Nigeria into different parts of Cameroon, but not from the Nigerian government or any government that I have evidence of. But it's mainly clandestine organized crime networks across the Sahel in general, and that's how they make money in selling these arms.
Thank you. And keeping with the illicit economy aspect of this report and this study, I was wondering, Nella, if you found that there was any gendered aspect at all to the illicit economy and extortion that we're seeing in this case. Are there, for example, any cases of women acting as leaders in this illicit economy?
There's certainly a case. I mean, I think that there's the illicit economy in certainly in the Northwest, and I can speak more confidently about the Northwest than the Southwest here, is not something that necessarily needs leaders. It's what is quite often referred to as the ant trade. It's a lot of kind of very mundane, everyday smuggling by small groups or small organizations of people crossing the border on a daily basis, mostly carrying quite mundane goods. The major component of the illicit economy is smuggled fuel. It's known as wenge, and it's brought over from Nigeria. And yeah, just to reiterate, I think I'm right in saying that there is still very barely any illicit fuel stations to the northwest of Bamenda, so there is no alternative but for people to use smuggled fuel. There just isn't any other fuel provision there. So this makes for a very big illicit economy. And while the gendered aspect of that wasn't a central question of our work, one thing that was made quite clear to us was the importance of women in that fuel trade, and certainly the fact that it's been this is one of the sort of complicated aspects of illicit economies. They have been really, really important in terms of supporting families when there are very few other sources of formal employment available. So that's one aspect. We did also more broadly in terms of the conflict, we did hear a lot about how women had taken on some quite important roles within Ambazonian separatist groups themselves. They were seen as less likely to come under suspicion, and so they were quite often used as intelligence gatherers. I hope that helps, and I see Aaron has a hand up, so I'm sure he's got something to add.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think there's something we left out with regards to illicit economies. The sale of marijuana, which is quite rampant in communities, especially in the Bui division, because it was a commonly grown drug in that part of the country, and separatist fighters have kind of taken over the production. And with regards to women, I think this is one thing I witnessed myself in Oku, where the women actually grow the cannabis inside cassava farms, because the cannabis leaves are very similar to cassava leaves, and so it kind of helps dissimulate them. I witnessed this when I was abducted in 2022 by separatist fighters. So their wives play some of them, they are married, and their wives play a good role in growing the cannabis plants that they intend sell and raise money. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron and Nella, for those insights. It's good to hear some sort of other aspects that perhaps were not covered by the report. We are coming to the end of our allotted time. I think we probably have room for one more question, just quickly. Lad, there's been several questions just around the fragmentation, which is obviously an important aspect of the report that you produced. Just quickly, would you be able to speak to whether this proliferation and fragmentation of groups, whether it tells us something about whether this report is becoming, whether this conflict is becoming more intractable and less amenable to conflict resolution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we certainly have seen at least the interests of armed groups becoming more and more localized. I think there's less and less kind of at least espoused interest in kind of creating an entire separate country by most of these groups. They're more contesting like a small territory, a small area. So kind of this turning towards the local from like broader territorial interests, I think is certainly something that we've seen. Kind of part of this is the growth of other forms of actors. I saw a couple of questions related to this. And that's that we've seen growth of other kind of community self-defense groups that are also kind of taking up arms to defend themselves, whether that's against separatists or against other perceived threats from the state or other groups. We mentioned in the report the growth of various forms of ethnic groups. I think Aaron actually touched on this, the arming of various Mbaroro, and the threats that is also posed to civilian populations. So with that, I think there's kind of competing interests all kind of playing out that's fragmented this conflict. And so a rising number of disparate armed groups that are sometimes working together, but I think one thing that we can share from sort of the ACLED insight is that there's more and more contestation both within separatist groups themselves, but also kind of competing separatist groups. So we're picking up on rising levels of violence between separatists instead of just separatists against the military or police forces. So those are some of the ways in which that fragmentation is happening and turning from kind of national level interests of a separate state to just kind of competing over smaller territories.
Thank you for those insights there, Lad. And I think that's probably quite a good way to end this discussion, looking at how we kind of see this conflict evolving into the future as we see greater levels of fragmentation. Unfortunately, we were not able to get to all the questions that we had there. We will try our best to get back to everyone who did submit questions. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists, Lad, Nella, Aaron, and Manu for their insights. Please do check out the report on Anglophone separatists in Cameroon, as well as our previous joint reports on JNIM in the Sahel and armed banditry in northwest Nigeria. We hope you found this discussion fruitful, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. Thank you.